Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about League of Legends balance. Since I'm a failure as an editor, enjoy this thought-provoking cinematic of minions fighting each other in reverse while I give my take on why League is in the current state that it's in. While it can be hard to question the balance of a game that's been able to maintain popularity for such a long time, some of the more recent additions feel like they belong in a different game. As a longtime player, I'm aware that some of my thoughts are fueled by nostalgia, but I can't help but notice a trend in how things have been handled recently. There was once a time where Riot dropped new toys at our doorstep with a pleasant handwritten note from Freak detailing how they're used. Nowadays, it feels more like they're breaking down our door, ripping the fun from our hands, and replacing it with their new and improved version. The first thing I'd like to look at are new releases. When the game first came out, Riot was able to consistently release new champions without fear of bloating the game. There was less of a burden on new champions being perfect because not everyone had to buy them. Another one would come out 2 weeks later that might be better suited to their playstyle. Champions were wacky, unrefined, and given nowhere close to 200 years of combined effort before they were released. This led to some unbalanced situations, but oftentimes the numbers were simply too high or too low. It never felt like they were created to bend the meta. Nowadays, there are far too many champions to keep up that release schedule, so they've resorted to reworks as well. Fair enough. For the sake of the argument, we'll consider all champions with major revamps new releases as well. Things like Poppy, Scion, or Kayle. Champions like Maokai or Shen, on the other hand, who've maintained the integrity of their kit, will be put into a different category. Champions like Maokai or Shen who've had their kits slightly updated have managed to find relevancy in multiple metas and even roles, despite their core identity barely being changed. You could say that it's because their design was better to begin with, but I believe it has more to do with them not being intentionally strong. Many new releases feel like they are made to be strong and end up having a forced life cycle in which if their numbers are good enough, they will naturally overcrowd other options. They're forcefully given their time in the spotlight and forcefully removed as well. Not only that, but it almost feels like new releases were designed just to fight each other. Yasuo, for example, was released around the beginning of Season 4. Kalista at the end. Rather than just spending some time to unload their kits a bit, they were given free reign to dominate everything else at the time. At the beginning of Season 5, Poppy's rework came out. Is it a coincidence that Riot almost immediately released a tank that would hard counter the most mobile champions ever to grace the Rift? Rather than just toning them down, something equally broken was made. Similarly, Kai'Sa was released just a year after Xayah, and the meta then became Xayah vs Kai'Sa for 2 years. Most recently, Aphelios was released a month after Senna, both of which pushed out every single other bot lane. Power creep is when things are constantly elevated to match the height of other more powerful things in a game. Riot's way of avoiding power creep is to be very selective about how they buff or nerf things. And although this works fairly well, this doesn't stop individual champions from creating a sense of power creep. If you don't know, I'll try to explain my take on how they balance things. They try to keep the champion's identity by nerfing everything except their strength. Rather than reduce everything equally, they turn the power that's not related to their identity into a foundation just big enough for the champion to be played. They also hand out buffs in a similar manner. They figure out the most important fantasy for a champion and act on it. In Kalista's case, it's being a lane bully. Champions are also eased into the meta over the course of a few patches to ensure that they're not too broken. I think this is a clever way to balance the game, but it often throws the community into confusion. I mean, what's 5 movement speed gonna do? But I think not all champions can be balanced in this manner, and Riot breaks their own rules when introducing new champions to the game. Reducing Miss Fortune's attack speed growth and movement speed was a smart way to lower her place in the meta, and it successfully lowered her win rate. But that's because her kit is so easy and straightforward, there's very little room for skill expression. When you look at problematic champions, they're treated the exact same way, leading to months, if not years of frustration. It's like trying to peel an apple the same way you would a banana. Sure, there's room for a champion like Akali in the game, but not the iteration where she can stealth under your tower. Despite that, it took 7 patches for this feature alone to be removed. How many champions were broken in competitive play, while having 40% win rates in solo queue. As we speak, Aphelios has the 5th lowest win rate for ADCs in Platinum Plus, yet he's had a nearly 100% presence in competitive play since he was released. I'm not sure that this is a very good metric to measure a champion's success with. Similarly, Ornn had a 73% presence in Spring Split. It's important not to look at the win rates here because you have to keep in mind that both Cloud9 and Immortals could both lock in these champions. The point is that both sides recognize their power. In a game with so many champions, it feels like very little attempt is made to be inclusive of all of them. It's as though Riot is so insecure about their kits being well constructed that the numbers have to be cranked up until they're undeniably the best. Does Ornn, the Mage, Death Knight, Paladin, Hunter, Rogue, Warrior, Enchanter, Tank, Bruiser, Wizard, Warlock, Priest, Assassin, Gunslinger, Druid, Shaman, Necromancer, Ninja, Bard, Monk, Conjurer, Robot, Blacksmith, Mystic, Warden, God, Illusionist, Templar, Wizard really need to also be an Assassin? I mean, I'm honestly fine with all the other things, but when I interact with him, it's like he's throwing me into a pool of molasses and comboing me like a 14-year-old Riven on ADHD meds. Brand is one of my favorite champions in League because he's on fire, throws fire, and when you land everything, you feel like you're on fire. It's incredibly rewarding. At the same time, he rarely gets played. That just makes it so much more special when he does. Excuse the pun, but it makes me feel burnt out and exhausted that if I'm truly trying to win, I have to confine myself to whatever cookie cutter meta champions Riot has refused to give appropriate nerfs to. What I'm asking for is almost contradictory. Let the meta run loose without keeping such a tight grip on it, but also pop out the corks that prevent the meta from actually flowing. It's worrisome because that's the sort of logic that gave us this patch right here, where a Rioter seemingly went on an ayahuasca trip in the jungle and returned with the knowledge that ADCs are to be cancelled. But that's just because they went overboard. Similar to how they went overboard when they buffed support's base armor to compensate for the removal of runes, and then re-added runes in the form of shards, allowing tank supports to start the game with 60 armor. But that's a topic for a different video. My point is, they're clearly not afraid to make changes, so how about changing the game to be less stale without completely forcing its hand? Long before the ADC update, people were already trying new things. This search for instant gratification is leading longtime players to get burnt out and tired of the game. Instead of just rocking the boat a little bit, it's constantly flipped. I can't help but think it's just human nature coming into play. Before, it was important that each champion release contributed to the success of the game as a whole, whereas now it's more about its uniqueness and individuality. Some of the earlier philosophies, such as not having too much healing in the game, were not only abandoned, but spit on in the form of Yuumi. It's no longer about upholding the traits that make the game so enjoyable, it's about creating a piece of art that leaves its mark on an already established behemoth. If I were a designer, I'm sure I'd be happy to have a champion with a high play rate on my resume. People's frustrations just aren't enough to affect League as a whole anymore. They're a multi-billion-dollar company and arguably the biggest game on the planet. Despite how mad the game makes people, they're addicted, including myself, and will probably continue to play. I'm no conspiracy theorist, but when myself and many others are left with dread over having to play with a constantly updated Yuumi, it really does make me feel like their goal is just to make sure they sell the new champions. Is it any coincidence that on the same patch a new Yuumi skin is released, her competitive presence goes from 12% to 71.1%? Instead of forcing her to be a tool for new players to learn the game, she's actually viable as a one-trick that players can reach the highest rank with, which, in my opinion, ruins the integrity of the game. So, how did things get like this? Well, the people pulling the strings behind the scene have changed. Morello, who warned of the dangers of both healers and a Rob Zaya to pay Kaisa situation, no longer works for the LoL dev team, along with a lot of other old rioters. Now, I don't intend to incite flame, but I was curious, so I looked into the devs in charge of Yuumi. For Maxwell, the lead designer, it was his first champion, and spawned from the idea of Endless Pillows, whom he said was working on it before he had even joined, which was only 2 years ago. Pillows was the lead designer on Zaya, Rakan, and Pyke. Noticing a trend? This guy has only ever created problematic champions. Aside from some minor reworks, Maxwell's first champion was Yumi. Game devs already receive enough hate, and I don't want to add to it. I don't dislike either of these people. Mistakes happen, not to mention this is purely my opinion as a player, which I'm sure is biased. But I do get the feeling that it would make sense for Yumi to negatively affect the game for as long as she has, simply to avoid bruising the ego of a fairly new designer. In comparison, let's look at Nico, who I consider to be one of the least problematic recent champion designs. She's quirky in the same sense that Brand is. She doesn't beg for attention, and apart from an unexpected attack speed build being broken on release, it didn't feel like she was made just to be overpowered. Regardless of whether or not you like Nico, her design is naturally healthier than Yumi simply because it doesn't insist upon itself. If you put time and effort into learning her, she could be rewarding. In fact, I'm sure that in the future, maybe with a little tweaking, she could actually become meta. She's nowhere near as popular, but that's because she doesn't cater to the lowest common denominator. Despite being released 6 months later and having a lower play rate, Yumi has received more significant patches in an effort to balance her than Nico has. While I'm sure the designer, Sol Kim, wouldn't mind his champion being a bit better or more popular, it's not repeatedly babied to ensure its strength, but instead given room to breathe. That being said, Sol Kim was in charge of some incredibly broken champion reworks like Galio, Irelia, and Poppy. He's already made his mark on the game and overseen additions that had soaring popularity. My point that I'm trying to make is that for a designer, their contribution is their baby. Newer designers might feel pressured to brand the game with their own flair, which can be either a good or a bad thing. As a previous competitive player, I speak from experience when I say it's easy to attach your self-worth with your job performance, but I'm not sure that it's for the better of the game to do that. As we saw in this infamous tweet, it's easy to get self-absorbed and disregard the importance of hearing each other out. Anyone who's worked in retail knows that customers aren't always right, but Riot doing this to their player base is more akin to someone insisting that because they like their steak well done, you should too. Just add a little bit of ketchup and it'll be quite alright, says Riot Lutzberg. I think what players want the most is to feel heard, especially pros, high elo players, or full-time slaves to the game. We might not understand the first thing about game design from the other side, but we understand when things don't feel right. We want to understand why things have to be the way they are, instead of just being told that's how it is. I try my best to step into others' shoes when I'm analyzing something, and when I step into the souls of Riot, I can see how they'd have to wade their way through a thick wall of noise and complaints with everything they do. In the same way that every NBA player should believe they're the next Jordan, every designer should believe they're a superstar that's doing what's best for the game. It's just that, from the outside, it feels like they're sometimes trying harder to satisfy their egos than contribute to an enjoyable experience. I'd like to say that I get it. Forcing yourself to walk on eggshells is just as bad as stomping around. Without any personality, things would feel stale. Not to mention, some of the most broken champions are often the most fun. What's always made the game so enjoyable, though, is its combination of simplicity and complexity. Right now, it feels like it might be skewed a bit too far in both directions. Complexity means infinite damage potential, and if you're looking for simple, you could play a champion that could be played with your mouse disconnected. League was never perfect, but I for one would appreciate a little bit of a return to form. I would appreciate if Riot found a way to be more in touch with their community without sacrificing the ways in which they keep the game exciting. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it and want more.